In the summer of 1260, one of the most powerful military machines in human history marched south. They had already burned Baghdad to ash. They had shattered the Abbasid Caliphate, a civilization that had stood for 5 centuries. The rivers of Mesopotamia ran black with ink from drowned libraries, and red with the blood of 1 million dead. No army had stopped them. No city had survived their approach. No kingdom had refused their authority and lived to tell of it. To the rulers of the remaining Islamic world, the Mongols were not merely an enemy. They were a verdict, a force of nature dressed in armor, carrying out what seemed to be the will of heaven itself. But on a September morning in the Jordan Valley, in a narrow, heat-baked valley known as Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, that verdict was challenged. What happened next would not only stop the Mongol advance, it would break their myth of invincibility forever. The question historians have debated for 7 centuries is not simply who won, but how. What weapon, what strategy, what combination of factors allowed a force of Egyptian soldiers to accomplish what the combined armies of Russia, Poland, Persia, and the Abbasid Caliphate had all failed to do? The answer is hidden inside the structure of the Mamluk military system, and it is more surprising than most people expect. To understand Ain Jalut, you must first understand what the Mongols had built and why it terrified the entire known world. In the early 13th century, a man named Temujin unified the fractious nomadic tribes of the Central Asian steppe under a single command. The world would come to know him as Genghis Khan, a title meaning universal ruler. By the time of his death in 1227, he had created the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. The Mongol military system was built on a principle that most medieval armies ignored entirely: ruthless, rational organization. Armies were structured on a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Command flowed downward with absolute clarity. Every soldier knew his unit, his commander, his role. There was no ambiguity in the Mongol chain of command. Their cavalry moved with a speed no infantry-based civilization could match. A Mongol army could cover 60 miles in a single day. They carried their food, dried meat and mare's milk, in saddlebags. They were not dependent on supply lines the way European or Persian armies were. But speed alone did not explain Mongol dominance. What made them genuinely revolutionary was their use of psychological warfare and intelligence. Before any major campaign, Mongol scouts, called Nurkur, would spend months mapping roads, identifying river crossings, locating food supplies, and cultivating informants inside enemy territory. By the time a Mongol army arrived at a city's walls, its commanders already knew the city's water sources, its garrison strength, its internal politics. This was not merely warfare. It was a systematic science of destruction. The psychological dimension of Mongol warfare was deliberately cultivated. Cities that submitted immediately were treated relatively well. Cities that resisted were subjected to systematic annihilation. Not merely defeated, annihilated. Every building burned. Every inhabitant killed or enslaved. Every garden salted. The goal was to ensure that the next city on the road to submission would receive word of what had happened and surrender without a fight. It worked. For decades, it worked with horrifying consistency. By 1258, the Mongols had reached the center of the Islamic world. Under the command of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongol army besieged Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city fell in February 1258. What followed shocked the entire world, Muslim and Christian alike. The Caliph, the symbolic leader of Sunni Islam, was executed. The House of Wisdom, repository of centuries of scientific and philosophical learning, was destroyed. Its scholars were killed or scattered. Contemporaries described the Tigris River running black with ink from the books thrown into it, and red with blood from the dead. Whether entirely literal or not, the metaphor captures what the fall of Baghdad meant. The Islamic world's greatest cultural center, a city of 1 million people, was gone in a matter of weeks. Nothing, it seemed, could stop what was coming next. After Baghdad, Hulagu Khan turned his attention westward. Syria lay ahead. Damascus, Aleppo, Antioch, the great cities of the Levant. And beyond Syria, Egypt, the richest, most populous remaining Islamic state and the seat of the Mamluk Sultanate. In 1260, Hulagu's forces captured Aleppo after a brief siege. Damascus surrendered without significant resistance. The Crusader states along the coast, watching the Mongol advance, made a fateful calculation. They would not resist. In fact, some Crusader leaders quietly negotiated arrangements of non-interference or limited cooperation with the Mongols. They feared the Mongols, yes, but some feared the resurgent power of Egypt more. This left the Mongols free to push toward the Sinai. But Hulagu faced a problem he had not fully anticipated. In 1259, the great Khan Murk died. Under Mongol law, all senior princes of the dynasty were required to return to the Mongol heartland to participate in the election of a new great Khan. Hulagu, who commanded the Western army, was compelled to withdraw the bulk of his forces eastward. He left behind a garrison force. The exact number is debated by historians, but the consensus points to a force of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 men, capable and experienced, but a fraction of the army that had shattered Baghdad. The man Hulagu left in command of the remaining force was Qutuz Noyan, a seasoned Mongol general and a Nestorian Christian. Qutuz was skilled, experienced, and possessed the supreme confidence that came from decades of unbroken Mongol victories. It was a confidence that would prove fatal. Meanwhile, in Cairo, a different kind of calculation was being made. The Sultan of Egypt at this moment was a young man named Qutuz. He had seized power in a palace coup only months before, and his position was far from secure. The Mamluk political system was volatile, brutal, and unforgiving. Sultans were regularly overthrown and killed by their own commanders. Qutuz received envoys from Qutuz, carrying a demand for submission. The Mongol letter, as described in contemporary sources, was characteristically direct. Submit, or face what Baghdad faced. Qutuz did something that no ruler in the path of the Mongol advance had done for decades. He executed the Mongol envoys and displayed their heads on the gates of Cairo. This was not impulsive rage. It was a deliberate strategic message. Egypt would fight. Qutuz knew what this declaration meant. There would be no negotiation now. The Mongols would come. But Qutuz had something no previous enemy of the Mongols had possessed in sufficient quantity: time, preparation, and the most sophisticated professional military force in the Islamic world. The Mamluks. To understand why the Mamluks could do what no other army had managed, you need to understand what they were and how they were made. The word Mamluk derives from an Arabic root meaning, one who is owned. Mamluks were slave soldiers. But that description, while technically accurate, fundamentally misrepresents what the Mamluk system actually produced. Mamluk soldiers were purchased as boys, typically from Turkic or Kipchak steppe tribes in Central Asia, the same ethnic and cultural world as the Mongols. They were brought to Egypt, converted to Islam, and placed in an intensive military academy. The training program lasted years. Recruits mastered mounted archery to a standard that rivaled the Mongols themselves. They learned swordsmanship, lance work, cavalry tactics, and military command. They were taught to read and write. They studied Islamic theology. By the time a Mamluk soldier completed his training, he was not merely a warrior. He was a professional, literate, disciplined, ideologically motivated, and technically formidable. The critical technical advantage the Mamluks possessed was not a secret weapon in the conventional sense. It was not a new siege engine. It was not a chemical compound. It was not superior numbers. It was a combination of three deeply integrated capabilities: mounted archery equal to the Mongols, a command structure that could execute complex cavalry maneuvers under extreme pressure, and the Furusiya, a comprehensive military training doctrine formalized in written manuals that governed everything from horse care to battlefield tactics to the psychological preparation of the soldier. Furusiya, meaning roughly the art of horsemanship and martial virtue, was a living military science. The Mamluks had studied the Mongols. They had access to survivors of Mongol campaigns. They understood Mongol tactical doctrine, the advanced screen, the feigned retreat, the encirclement. They had built training regimens specifically designed to counter these tactics. No other army facing the Mongols had done this. Most relied on traditional formations, developed for fighting other infantry-heavy medieval armies. The Mamluks had reverse-engineered their enemy. There was a second factor the Mamluks held that was equally decisive: motivation. Mongol armies were largely composed of steppe nomads and levied troops from conquered peoples. They fought for loot, for the Khan's authority, and for the momentum of an empire accustomed to winning. But they had no particular ideological investment in fighting in the Levant. The Mamluks, by contrast, were defending Islam itself. After the fall of Baghdad, religious scholars throughout the surviving Islamic world had framed the Mongol threat in existential terms. Cairo was not merely the capital of Egypt. It was now the last major surviving center of Islamic civilization. For the Mamluk soldier, this was not merely a battle. It was a religious duty. Qutuz also made a strategically brilliant political decision in the weeks before the campaign. He contacted the most dangerous of his own commanders, a man named Baybars al-Bundakdari, and offered a reconciliation. Baybars had fled Egypt after a previous political conflict. He was now leading an independent force in Syria. Baybars was perhaps the finest cavalry commander in the Islamic world. Qutuz needed him, and Baybars, seeing the magnitude of the threat, accepted. Their alliance was tense and uneasy, but it held, at least long enough to fight. In the late summer of 1260, Qutuz led the Mamluk army out of Cairo and north through the Sinai. The decision to advance rather than defend was deliberate. Fighting in Egypt itself would mean fighting on ground the Mongols had already psychologically prepared. Fighting in the Levant, beyond the Sinai in Syria and Palestine, offered a different terrain and a different dynamic. It also required passing through Crusader territory. The Crusaders at Acre faced a stark choice. They could oppose the Mamluk march, an act that would almost certainly bring a Mamluk army against their walls. They could align with the Mongols, which several factions had been considering. Or they could stand aside and allow the two powers to destroy each other. Acre chose neutrality. More than that, they allowed Mamluk forces to resupply in Crusader territory and provided intelligence on Mongol positions. It was a decision born of cold calculation, not religious sympathy. The Crusaders understood that whoever won, they would need to manage the relationship carefully. Kitbuka, commanding the Mongol force in Syria, received intelligence that the Mamluk army was approaching. His response tells us much about the Mongol state of mind in 1260. He did not call for reinforcements. He did not seek a defensive position. He advanced to meet the Mamluks with the full confidence of a commander who had never lost. Decades of Mongol success had created a structural vulnerability, an inability to imagine a different outcome. The two armies converged on the Jezreel Valley in early September 1260. The Jezreel, also called the Valley of Esdraelon, was a wide, flat agricultural plain in what is today northern Israel. To the south lay the rolling hills of Samaria. To the north, the slopes of the Galilee. At the eastern end of the valley, near a spring the Arabs called Ain Jalut, the terrain narrowed between ridgelines. Qutuz had chosen this ground carefully. The Mamluk vanguard, the advance force under Baybars, moved into the valley floor as the sun began to crest the hills to the east. Baybars's orders were specific and demanding. He was to make contact with the Mongol force, engage them, draw them in, and then retreat. Not because he was beaten, but to create the illusion of a breaking line, pulling the Mongols deeper into the valley, toward the waiting trap. The Mongols engaged with their characteristic aggression. Their forward cavalry crashed into Baybars's line. The Mamluk vanguard fought, absorbed pressure, and to any observer appeared to fracture. Units began pulling back. Gaps appeared in the line. To Kitbuka, this looked familiar. This was what Mongol pressure always produced: collapse, rout, panic. He ordered his forces forward. But what happened next was not collapse. It was theater. Baybars's units retreated in disciplined order, maintaining formation, controlling their horses, pulling the Mongols further east along the valley floor. The retreat was controlled to a degree that most medieval cavalry forces simply could not execute. It required the precise horsemanship and unit cohesion that only years of Furusiya training could produce. The Mongols advanced deeper and deeper. Qutuz had positioned the main Mamluk army in the hills, on the northern and southern flanks of the valley. They waited, hidden in the slopes. Still, as the Mongol advance moved deeper into the funnel of the valley, the trap was set. At a signal, reportedly the cry of the Sultan himself, the flanking Mamluk forces descended from both sides simultaneously. The Mongols, now caught on three sides, with Baybars's reformed line in front and flanking forces on both sides, were thrown into an unfamiliar tactical situation. They fought with ferocity. Kitbuka attempted to organize a counter-maneuver. At one point in the battle, the Mongol left flank broke through the Mamluk line, and Qutuz himself was required to rally his forces personally, a moment recorded in several contemporary accounts. This was not a clean or easy Mamluk victory. It was brutal. Chaotic close. Kitbuka was captured toward the end of the fighting. He reportedly refused to plead for his life, maintaining the pride of a Mongol commander to the last. According to Ibn Khaldun, a contemporary chronicler, when told that he would die, Kitbuka replied that he had served his Khan faithfully and feared no death. He was executed on the field. By late afternoon on September 3, 1260, the Mongol force in the Levant was destroyed. Those who escaped the valley were pursued by Mamluk cavalry across Syria. Within weeks, Mongol garrisons were cleared from Damascus, Aleppo, and the other Syrian cities. For the first time in the history of the Mongol Empire, a field army had been not merely halted, but annihilated. The immediate political consequences were vast. Syria was reabsorbed into the Mamluk sphere. The population of Damascus, which had submitted to the Mongols with resignation, received the returning Mamluk army with extraordinary relief. The city had survived. Its scholars, its traders, its inhabitants, all of whom had looked toward the precedent of Baghdad, now understood that a different outcome was possible. For the Mongol Empire, Ain Jalut delivered a shock that resonated from Cairo to Karakoram. The Mongols launched subsequent campaigns against the Mamluks, 3 major invasions over the following decades. None succeeded. The pattern of Ain Jalut repeated. Mamluk tactical discipline, combined with the geography of the Levant, consistently frustrated Mongol operational methods. What Ain Jalut proved was structural. The Mongol military system that had conquered open steppe and flat Persian plains was not invincible on all terrain and against all opponents. Qutuz did not enjoy his victory for long. Within weeks of Ain Jalut, while the army was returning to Egypt, he was assassinated by a group of Mamluk commanders, led by Baybars himself. The arrangement between them, the political alliance that had made the battle possible, dissolved the moment the common threat was removed. Baybars had extracted a promise from Qutuz during the campaign, control of Aleppo as reward for his service. Qutuz refused to honor it. The result was the Sultan's death in the desert. Baybars became Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and proved to be one of the most formidable rulers of the medieval world. He spent the following 2 decades consolidating Mamluk power, rebuilding Syria, and systematically dismantling the remaining Crusader states. He was, in many ways, the direct product of Ain Jalut, a commander whose military genius had been sharpened against the finest army in the world, and who emerged from that experience with absolute confidence in his own system. Historians often describe Ain Jalut as a turning point. It was. But the reasons behind that turning point are more instructive than the event itself. The Mongols did not lose at Ain Jalut because they suddenly became weak. The force that Qutuz commanded was experienced, aggressive, and technically excellent. It lost because it was fighting a specific opponent in a specific terrain that negated its core advantages. The Mongol military system was optimized for open-steppe warfare, wide flanking maneuvers, feigned retreats drawing enemies into pursuit, encirclement on open ground. In the Jordan Valley, terrain compressed their options. Flanking was limited by the ridgelines. The feigned retreat, the cornerstone of Mongol tactical doctrine, was turned against them because the Mamluks were the one force on earth that had specifically trained to execute an organized feigned retreat of their own. The hunter's most reliable weapon was taken from him and used against him. The deeper structural truth is this: the Mongols were conquered not by a miracle, not by a secret formula, but by an opponent who had done something devastatingly simple: studied them. The Mamluk system had produced soldiers of equivalent physical capability to Mongol warriors. The Furusiya doctrine had built a command structure capable of executing complex maneuvers under pressure. And the specific intelligence gathered about Mongol tactics had allowed the Mamluks to identify and exploit the feigned retreat as a vulnerability. Knowledge, in the most literal military sense, defeated power. The battle also carried an enormous psychological consequence that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The myth of Mongol invincibility, which had caused entire armies to dissolve before contact, entire cities to surrender without a fight, was shattered at Ain Jalut. This did not eliminate the Mongol threat, but it changed the psychological landscape of the entire region. After September 3, 1260, commanders who faced the Mongols knew they could be beaten. That knowledge was worth 10,000 soldiers. We began this story at the moment of shock. The Mongols burning Baghdad, the rivers of Mesopotamia carrying the weight of a civilization into the sea. At that moment, the world seemed to have reached a terminus, an endpoint. The Mongol advance appeared as inevitable as the tide. What Ain Jalut demonstrated is that the tide can be read. It can be studied. And if you understand its patterns with sufficient precision, if you build a system capable of meeting it on equal terms, it can be stopped. The Mamluks did not stop the Mongols with a secret weapon. They stopped them with something rarer and more difficult to build. A military system so thoroughly prepared, so precisely calibrated, that when the moment came, it simply did what it had trained to do. At Ain Jalut, on September 3, 1260, the unstoppable was stopped. And the world it protected, the remnant of Islamic civilization in the Levant and Egypt, survived to rebuild, to endure, and to flourish.